You notice it in small moments. When someone your age shares good news, and you pause for just a second too long before reacting. Not because you're jealous, but because something inside you quietly asks, wait, where am I in all this? You still say congratulations, you still smile. But there's a slight delay, like your mind had to catch up to your face. And you don't talk about that part. Because from the outside, it doesn't make sense. Nothing is technically wrong. You're moving, doing things, trying. But there's this quiet feeling, like everyone else got a head start you didn't see happen. And the strange part is, it's not loud. It doesn't show up as panic. It doesn't scream. It just sits there in the background, making ordinary moments feel slightly off. Like you're participating in your own life, but not exactly aligned with it. Most people would look at that and simplify it. They'd call it comparison, or impatience, or say you're overthinking things. But that's not quite it. Because this feeling doesn't go away when you stop scrolling. It doesn't disappear when you take a break or focus on yourself. It follows you into quiet spaces. It shows up when you're alone, doing nothing. When there's nothing to compare against. Which means it's coming from somewhere deeper. And people rarely understand that. They assume it's about wanting more. But it often feels more like something didn't start when it was supposed to. Like a timeline you never agreed to, somehow moved without you. And you've been trying to catch up ever since. This is the part most people don't say out loud. The sense that you're behind in life isn't always about where you are. It's about how your brain has learned to measure movement, progress, and time. And that system doesn't just come from nowhere. It's built, quietly, over years. Sometimes from watching other people be acknowledged for milestones you never got recognized for. Sometimes from growing up in environments where progress was expected, but never clearly defined. Or where nothing ever felt like enough. So your mind adapted. It started tracking things differently. Not just what you've done, but what you haven't done yet. Not just where you are, but where you should have been by now. And over time, that lens becomes automatic. You don't consciously choose it anymore. It just runs in the background. Neuroscience actually gives us a clue about this. Your brain has a system that constantly predicts and evaluates your position in relation to your environment. It's part of how you make decisions, set goals, and assess risk. But when that system is shaped by uncertainty or inconsistent feedback, it becomes less about direction and more about correction. Instead of asking, where am I going? It keeps asking, why am I not there yet? And that shift changes everything. Because now, even when you're moving, it doesn't feel like movement. It feels like catching up. And catching up has a very specific emotional tone. It's quiet pressure. It's subtle urgency. It's the sense that rest is something you have to earn, but never quite do. That's why even your achievements can feel strangely incomplete. You reach something and almost immediately, your mind moves the target. Not because you're ungrateful, but because your internal system was never trained to register enough as a stopping point. Only as a checkpoint. This doesn't come from laziness. It usually comes from adaptation. From learning early on that stability wasn't guaranteed, or recognition was inconsistent, or expectations kept shifting. So your brain did something intelligent. It removed the idea of arrival and replaced it with continuous adjustment. That way, you'd never fall too far behind, because you'd always be trying to close the gap. The problem is that gap doesn't have a fixed end point. It moves, and you move with it, which is why this feeling can follow you, no matter what stage you're in. There's another layer people don't expect. Sometimes the feeling of being behind shows up strongest in people who are actually very aware. People who think deeply, who reflect, who notice patterns in themselves and others. Because awareness does something subtle. It expands your sense of what's possible, but it also expands your awareness of what hasn't happened yet. So while other people might feel settled with less information, your mind keeps scanning. Comparing timelines, imagining alternatives, calculating missed paths. Not in an obsessive way. More like a constant background analysis. And that can make time feel different. More compressed. Like there's always more you should have figured out by now. But here's the part that's easy to miss. That same system, the one that makes you feel behind, is also the reason you notice things other people don't. It's why you pick up on shifts in behavior. Why you sense when something feels off. Why you can reflect on your own patterns instead of just reacting to them. There's depth there, but depth comes with a cost. Because when you see more, you measure more. And when you measure more, you can feel like you're falling short, even when you're not. That's the paradox. The very mechanism that creates the pressure is also what creates your awareness. And it doesn't mean something is wrong. It means something developed in a very specific way. A lot of this traces back to how your sense of progress was formed. Not just what you achieved, but how those achievements were acknowledged. Or not acknowledged. If effort didn't consistently lead to recognition, your brain learned not to trust completion. If expectations were unclear, your brain learned to anticipate gaps. If comparison was present early, your brain learned to evaluate itself externally. None of that feels dramatic while it's happening. But over time, it builds a framework. And that framework becomes the lens you use to see your life. So when you feel like you're behind, it's not just a thought. It's a perception shaped by years of subtle conditioning. And perceptions feel real. They don't feel like interpretations. They feel like truths. That's why it's so convincing. Even when there's no clear evidence. Even when, objectively, you're doing fine. Your internal system is still asking a different question. Not, am I okay? But am I where I'm supposed to be by now? And that question doesn't have a universal answer. Because there is no single timeline. There never was. But your brain doesn't operate on that level of abstraction. It operates on patterns. And if the pattern it learned is progress equals urgency, then stillness feels like risk. Even when it is. This is where people usually try to fix it. They try to slow down, or compare less, or just focus on themselves. But those solutions stay on the surface. Because the feeling isn't coming from behavior alone. It's coming from interpretation. From how your mind assigns meaning to where you are. And meaning is sticky. It doesn't change just because you tell it to. It shifts when it's understood. When you start to see the pattern, not as a flaw, but as something that made sense at the time it formed. Something that helped you navigate uncertainty. Something that kept you attentive, adaptive, aware. That doesn't mean it's always helpful now. But it explains why it's there. And understanding that changes the tone of the feeling. It softens it. Because now, instead of I'm behind, it starts to sound more like, my system is still trying to protect me in a way that no longer fully fits. And that's a very different place to experience it from. It's quieter, less urgent, more observant. There's no judgment in that space. No need to force yourself into a different pace. Just the recognition that your relationship with time, progress, and self-evaluation was shaped, not chosen. And shaped things can be reshaped. Slowly, not by pushing harder, but by noticing differently. By catching those moments, like when someone shares good news. And instead of questioning your position, you notice the pause itself. You get curious about it, without rushing to fix it. Because that pause is where the pattern lives. and where it can begin to shift. Not all at once, but gradually, quietly, in ways that don't need to be announced. Because the truth is, you were never actually late to your own life. You just learned to measure it through a lens that made it feel that way. And once you see that, the timeline loses some of its grip. Not completely, but enough to breathe differently inside it. And that might not look like a big change from the outside. But internally, it's everything. Because now you're not chasing a moving target. You're observing the system that created it. And that changes the experience entirely. There's probably more to that than you've fully noticed yet. Subtle patterns, small reactions, quiet assumptions that still run in the background. If this kind of content speaks to you, you already know what to do.